Hey everyone, my name's Eugene Meidinger, and my nouns are he, him. And this talk is how I deal with depression. And this can be a difficult subject, and it is intended as an example, as a case study. It's not a solution. I haven't solved depression for myself, and I know that people's experiences are going to differ. And so I figured, well, I'm not a medical professional, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I can at least talk about what's worked for me and what hasn't. Just a heads up to anyone watching, I've had to re-record the first 5 or 6 minutes of this talk, so you'll notice a bit of a jump or change in tone during the first picture with me on a couch. I was definitely a lot more nervous when I was giving the talk live. So real quick about me, I'm a business intelligence consultant. So people pay me lots of money to talk about Power BI. I'm a Pluralsight author, so people pay me lots of money to learn stuff on the fly and then present on it. Right now I'm trying to learn Jaspersoft, which is this niche reporting technology. And I help organize the Group Buy conference. And this talk has nothing to do with any of these. This talk is about how I deal with depression on a daily basis. So what are we going to cover today? First, some content warnings and disclaimers. This is a delicate subject. We're going to touch upon some delicate topics, and I want to make sure that you're staying safe and you're taking care of yourself. And so, this is recorded. I won't be offended if you decide not to watch it, or you decide to watch a little bit and come back later, or whatever's best for you. I'm going to talk a little bit about my story and what depression has been like for me and how it started. I'm going to talk about what depression is in general, and I'm not going to be going through the DSM criteria. I'm going to be talking about what it feels like, things that stand out, things that I wish that someone had taken 20-year-old Eugene and said, look, if you see these things, you're probably depressed. We're going to talk about measuring it, because this is a data-focused audience, and so we're going to talk about how to measure it, and then we're going to talk about treating it, at least the treatments that I take, and then finally some recommended reading. So, first, a content warning. This talk contains evocative photography. So, I've got a couple pictures that I took back in college, and they're very dramatic. But there's no gore, there's no violence or anything like that. They're just very emotional. There'll be talk of suicidal ideation. Whenever you just kind of want to get off this ride, but you don't have a plan. There'll be some negative self-talk, and because of webcam issues at the time, you will not get to see a grown man crying on camera, but you'll certainly hear it in my voice. So, with all that said, it's time to do a safety check. If you are considering suicide, stop this video, and if you're in the U.S., call the National Suicide Hotline. I have the number here. Your life is important and valuable. I am supremely confident that you are a person of worth and value, and that people would miss you if you were to die. I'm 100% confident of that. And so if you have a plan, if you're thinking about it, please get help. The other safety check, I'm going to have it on here very briefly, is if you are suffering from domestic violence, that is a valid reason to be depressed because you are being abused. 800-799-SAFE or 7233 is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And so, with that out of the way, the final disclaimer: your mileage will vary. People's lives are different, people's lived experiences are different, and I may... Jeez. Sorry about that. I may suggest things that don't mesh with your life, that may not be an option for you, and I understand that. And so this talk is about what's worked for me, and hopefully it gives you some ideas, but every person's different. So, whoop. So what is my story? So I've dealt with depression since college. Um, when I was younger, this was not an issue for me, but I was also surrounded by family. I lived with my dad and my grandparents. And then that started to change around college. My grandparents started passing away, family started moving away, and my life changed. And I do a number of things to treat it. I take Lexapro, but that's not a cure-all for me. I try to exercise. I try to sleep well. I do a number of things to treat it. And treat is the right word, because just like how I have diabetes and have to treat that every day, I have depression and I have to treat that every day. And my hope is that this depression is going to be more like type 2 diabetes, which can be cured through lifestyle changes, and less like type 1 diabetes, which requires a constant supplement to my biochemistry in general. So with type 1 diabetes, I'm insulin dependent. I'm going to be on insulin for the rest of my life. My hope is that this is not something I am dealing with for the rest of my life, but we will see. So what does it feel like? What does depression feel like from the inside? So let's take a look at two photos that'll help explain that. So first is this photo, and this is sadness and grief. I took this photo when my grandparents started passing away.
And I want to be clear that sadness and grief are healthy. They are a normal, sometimes beautiful part of human existence and the human condition, right? They can be uncomfortable, they can be unpleasant, but sadness and grief are good in the sense that it's good to feel emotions. It is good to feel feelings. And I would not classify these feelings as medical depression unless they persist for more than 2 weeks and start interfering with your ability to do everyday tasks, right? So this is a photo of grief. So let's take a look at a photo of depression. So this is what I would consider depression to feel like. There is both sadness and a frustration, but there is also this inward anger. There is this self-criticism, all this sort of stuff. And I took this picture around the same time. Both times in college, I was experimenting with photography. And it's funny because I have a record of my depression starting back in college on Facebook, right? This was the post I wrote over a decade ago regarding the photo that I had made. And there's a part I've highlighted there and it's hard to read, so I have it bigger for you. At the time, I had this continual irrational thought that I was an evil person. It was bugging the heck out of me because I knew I wasn't and I couldn't convince myself, right? That's the distinction that I want to make between healthy sadness and grief and medical depression. Depression feels like continual irrational thoughts that you can't convince your way out of. You can't just logic and argumentation your way out of it. And so, when we start to pick apart some of these pieces, it can be easy to look at how it feels and not have any vocabulary for it and be like, well, I'm just sad, right? I feel lethargic. I feel discouraged. I feel low. I'm just sad, right? Like, especially, for me and the way that I was raised, like my grandpa, the one that passed away and I took that photo, he was like full-blooded German, right? Like, I don't know if he ever said, "I love you." So I did not have like a vernacular for emotions in that inner life. Instead, he showed me love through having me pour concrete, quality time, right? But I think often there's these three horsemen that are very prevalent when dealing with depression. And I first learned about this from the Cognitive Behavioral Workbook for Depression that I'll have in the recommended reading at the end. But there's the first horseman is feeling helpless, right? It's not enough that, okay, things are difficult, but that lack of self-efficacy, that feeling that you are not able to change your circumstance or that that you can't do anything about it. And there's this whole set of research about the idea of learned helplessness, right? There's what I would consider by today's standards some unethical studies that were done decades ago where they would shock a dog, and if they had it in a harness where it couldn't get away, it would stop fighting. It would stop trying. Whereas if it could get away from the negative stimulus, then it would be fine. And the results look very similar to depression. And certainly at the beginning of this, for me, this was definitely there. Another thing is feeling hopeless or hopelessness. So not only do you feel like you don't have the ability to change your situation, but the feeling that it's not ever going to change, right? And then finally, and again, this is one of the biggest ones that separates or helps divide healthy sadness from an unhealthy depression of some sort, and that's feeling worthless, right? There so often in my experience is this constant self-criticism, this constant rumination, and so I encourage you, look at your own feelings and are these three horsemen there? And if they are, there's a good chance that, that's, I'm trying to think how to, sorry, I got distracted there. These are a good sign that you're dealing with actual depression, right? And so another way to think about this is if you, oh, hold on. Is it working? Boop. I don't know why it stopped working. So have you ever been to the grocery store and you made the mistake of grabbing the first cart, right? And that's the cart that somebody left out and didn't put away. And there's a reason they didn't put it away. And that's because it's wobbly, right? It's got that one bad wheel. And I think from a mental health standpoint, from a mental standpoint, a brain standpoint, thinking about depression, it's very often a helpful thing about that, like you are adrift. Your ability to perceive the world accurately is just a little bit off. There is a tendency or a bias towards certain types of thinking, certain types of relating to the world. And so you may be right about the facts from an objective standpoint, but the way that you interpret those facts could be vastly off. And specifically, I want to talk about explanatory styles. So there's a wiki link there, but I have also found this to be, at least in my experience, to be very, very true. When we talk about explanatory styles, there's three pieces to it. People who deal with depression or similar things often treat everything first as personal, right? So, we can imagine a situation where I'll use Mala because she's a friend. This hasn't happened, but sometimes I will help her out with a presentation, and you can imagine a situation where she has to reschedule at the last minute, right? And I could explain that as, oh, Mala is a busy person and she has stuff going on, or I could say, it's about me, right? Especially if like someone seems upset, you know, when you are depressed, when something goes wrong, you have a tendency to say, oh, this is my fault. This is reflective of me, you know, as opposed to explaining ways like, well, maybe they're having a bad day, right? Um, Another part is pervasiveness, right? I suffer from this a lot where um, I will mess something up. Like, I'll give you a perfect example. I forgot about a meeting yesterday. I had a meeting with a colleague of mine, Carlos, and I just completely blew it off because I didn't have it on my calendar and I forgot about it. And I have this reflexive impulse. I suffer from these automatic negative thoughts where I think, oh, I'm a failure, right? And obviously that's ridiculous, but these cognitive distortions, which we'll talk about with cognitive behavioral therapy, are normal. And think about that. The word failure is a pervasive label, right? It's not saying, oh, I goofed up, or even saying, you know what, I'm bad at my job, right? I'm a great husband, I'm a great son, I'm a great friend, but you know what, I suck at computers. I should just stop, right? It's not even that. It's saying I, as a human being, as an entire entity, am a failure. And so, you know, that's black and white thinking, which is a cognitive distortion. Another cognitive distortion is this mental filtering. And so again, we'll talk about these distortions when we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy. But it's like you have a little drop of ink and you put in some water and the whole thing becomes black, right? That's what this pervasive explanatory style does. And then finally, there's permanent. And so, you know, okay, I miss a meeting and I make it personal because I don't say, oh, well, you know what, like I've been sleeping poorly and I've been stressed out about stuff because we just worked on a basement. Instead I say, no, it's my fault. I'm bad. And I say I'm bad as an entirety, as a whole being. So that's pervasiveness. And then I say it's permanent, right? This will never change. I will always be this way. And so these 3 Ps are common when you're depressed. And so you can be dead right on the empirical facts. I did miss a meeting and Carlos could be upset. Ended up being fine, but my explanatory style changes how I perceive that information. And so again, it's this wobbly grocery cart. We're still going to the same part of the grocery store, but it's just, it keeps going to the right and wanting to crash into these grocery aisles. And so, you know, you can look up the DSM official criteria for depression, and there's a variety of different types. So, you know, you can have anhedonia, where it's just a loss of pleasure. You can have mild depression. You can have major depression. But these are some of the things that really stand out to me of like, oh, this is happening, and I feel like I can start to get my arms around it. So if you are suffering from some type of depression, or even just think that you are, my immediate recommendation is, in a low effort way as possible, start collecting data. And so we'll see some examples of that. So I use it's a free application. I pay for it so I don't get ads and dumb stuff. I use an application called Dailyo. It's very, very simple. Basically at 8 p.m. it'll ask me what my mood was on a scale of 1 to 5. Technically it's a scale of rad to awful. And then I can input other stuff that was going on, like, oh, I was with friends, or I had work, or something happened. I don't really do that. I just use it as a way to keep track of my mood. And don't try and interpret all of this, but I just wanted you to see, like, all right, I have all these data points. Well, what if I actually map it out? And so I did. For the first time I did, I pulled it out into Excel and I did a 2-week rolling average, right? And you can definitely see some patterns. And I find this useful because if there's a bias in my perception of the world, then when I collect data, I can actually verify or deny those assumptions. And one of the things that's here over on the far left that you can see that I never actually knew is I had like these monthly cycles, right? And that might be just life and the fact that I get paid monthly, right? I invoice monthly. It might be just the fact that I mean, that was right after COVID started, so it was just a crazy time. But I never realized that, right? And so that's useful information to look at and be like, oh, well, I have these monthly cycles, right? But then there's other stuff here too. So let me see if I can get rid of that. So you'll notice this big drop, and it was even bigger if you look at just the daily numbers. But that huge first drop there, that was when my mom got diagnosed with breast cancer, and she's fine now. She went through treatment. It's in remission. Everything's fine. We caught it super early, but I was a wreck, right? And the numbers show it. And so it's really useful to be able to say, oh, this is not a normal week, right? To be able to, instead of having to trust your subjective sense of mood, that you have some way of recording it down so you have a reference point, right? And then you can see during the summer it started to get better. And then the next drop was the US election. And I'm not going to get into politics, but let's just say I looked at the stuff, and that week right after the election was pretty dicey, right? For obvious reasons. And then you'll notice that I always struggle with the wintertime. You'll notice that it was starting to go down, and then there's a point where it just starts shooting back up, back in April. And that's pretty much exactly when I got vaccinated, right? So, you know, wintertime kept wearing on me, and then I got vaccinated and went on a vacation, and now, you know, I'm the happiest I've been in a year, right? And I have something to back that up. Another way that you can measure these things is with a weekly self-assessment. I find this to be very useful. There are a number of them out there. There's the Burns Depression Checklist, the Beck Depression Inventory, and the Major Depression Inventory. I use the first one just because I enjoy Feeling Good by Burns, but it is copywritten, right? The Major Depression Inventory is by the World Health Organization, and so it's not copywritten, but I went ahead and did it today, and so I'm a 20 out of 100. And a lot of that is self-criticism and that sort of thing, and a lot of these automatic negative thoughts, which we'll talk about. And so, you know, I'm not sad all the time, but there is a lot of feeling discouraged, a lot of criticism, and so I have mild depression based on this inventory. And so I don't do this every week, but you could. Right? And I think it's a good tool, especially if you're in treatment or you're doing stuff to try and make a difference. So this is a really effective way, and there's clinical studies to back it up, that this does, despite being subjective, because it's a self-reporting mechanism, it has been found to correspond with what doctors might find. So, you know, just if you're unsure, go fill this out, and then if you get a 30, you're like, oh, because I know for me, like, again, German heritage, certain inherited ideas of what it means to be masculine, you know, my natural impulse is kind of like to trudge on through, right? That whole stiff upper lip. And so sometimes it's really helpful to have something external to be like, you are depressed, go get help. And then the third way is tracking automatic negative thoughts. So these are a perennial problem for me, and I've gotten better at them. But these are thoughts that occur almost instantly, right? So again, I missed a meeting, and it's really easy to be like, I am a failure, I am an idiot, right? And those grooves have gotten worn deeper and deeper over time, and so they get more automatic. And what I've done some months is I've actually tracked the number of automatic negative thoughts. And so I know it's hard to read, but basically back in January, I did this for the whole month. And it started out where I was averaging 8 to 18 negative thoughts per day. I've had as high as 30 or 40 on normal days when things are bad, or like 60 or 80 if I like have a terrible night's sleep. And what I do is when I'm trying to focus on this stuff, I will carry around a physical tally counter in my pocket. And it feels silly, but you know what? I have an automatic negative thought. I press the button, I move on. Especially whenever I'm having so many that I don't have the energy to argue with it. And not in the true argumentative sense, but using cognitive behavioral therapy to do something called where you identify the trigger and then the belief and then the cognition. And this helps me. It not only gives me a record for how I'm doing, but it helps me have a sense of how I'm doing. And it helps me get better at catching these. And you'll notice, if you can read the tiny print, there was a period of 5 days, where I had it down to 0 a day, right? And this is hard work. This is a Sisyphean task where you're pushing a boulder up a hill. But with cognitive behavioral therapy and meditation, I've had good days, and it's been hard to find the time and the energy to do this consistently. But I truly believe and hope that I can get to the point where that's normal. I've gotten to points in the past where I catch myself. I slow down the process and catch myself before the automatic negative thought happens, and sometimes replace it. Instead of like that whole meeting thing, instead of thinking I'm a failure, I will be able to catch myself through meditation and practice and say, I'm feeling embarrassed, right? Because what I've realized is that a lot of times I'm looking for certainty and closure, and I would rather be unkind to myself than to deal with the uncertainty that I'm in this gray area, that I'm a imperfect but not terrible person, right? So those are 3 ways that you can start measuring it. And so the next question is, how do you start treating it? And so I'm going to talk about some ways that I manage in general, and then so I've got 2 slides of that, and then I've got a slide of some recommended reading. And then I think we're going to have plenty of time for any questions anyone might have. So how do I manage? So for me, it's a combination of 2 things. It's a combination of official treatments, so things that I do specifically to deal with depression and to some degree anxiety, since actually anxiety is probably the bigger issue these days because I've done so much to treat the depression, which I guess is a nice problem to have. But the 2 are pretty interwoven for me. And then lifestyle changes, right? So things that are not necessarily intended to treat depression itself, but have that benefit, or they have what one might call a prophylactic effect. They help mitigate and prevent depression. So let's talk about treatments first. The biggest one is cognitive behavioral therapy. I've got some book recommendations. If you have not done any therapy before, I recommend looking into cognitive behavioral therapy. There are a number of different treatments for depression. My understanding is that many of them have a similar efficacy. But my understanding, again, I'm not a medical professional, but from what I've read, cognitive behavioral therapy is kind of the gold standard in treatment for depression today. And so the way that cognitive behavioral therapy works is that we try to understand that our behaviors, our beliefs, and our thoughts are interwoven, and we can start to separate those out and start working on one and improve all the others. And so one of the things that's most helpful for me is to do what's called the ABC exercise, which you'll find in some of the books that I recommend, although I've expanded out to an ABCDE exercise. So A stands for activating event. And I'll literally, again, I wish I was on webcam, I will use sign language to keep track of the letters as I go through it because I'll do it out in public. But you can write this down. A is the activating event. So again, activating event, I missed the meeting. I screwed up, right? We had a weekly standing meeting And I just like got distracted, and it wasn't on my calendar because I was looking at the Google one and not Outlook, and Outlook was closed. Activating event um, is I blew off a meeting by accident. The belief might be that I am a failure. And so the C is to identify the consequences or cognitions that are a result of that. So I would identify this is black and white thinking. I am saying that either I am perfect or I am a failure. I would identify a cognitive distortion of labeling. I am trying to put Eugene in a box, and it is an ill-shaped box because, again, I could be bad at my job. People pay me a lot of money, right, for what I sometimes call a failure, but I could be bad at my job. That's entirely within the realm of possibility. But you know what? I am a multifaceted individual. I am a husband. I am a dog owner. My dog Tyson loves me. He would never suggest that I am bad at my job. I am a wonderful son because I'm going to take my mom to a bird fair 2 hours away, and I don't want to, right? I think there are people here who would say I'm a great friend, a great speaking mentor, whatever. And then D would be disputing those thoughts. So what I just did, like, hey, this doesn't match up with reality. And then E would be, okay, what's the effect of this exercise? How do I feel now, right? And so cognitive behavioral therapy is a very pragmatic, empirical approach, right? It's trying to give you more breathing room between the stimulus, the cognition, and the response. And a lot of it's about, okay, I'm going to write down, I expect to have a terrible time at this party. Well, I'm going to write down how I expect to feel, and then I'm going to write down afterwards and be empirical about it. So I very strongly recommend cognitive behavioral therapy. It is, to my understanding, the gold standard in this. Another thing that I recommend is meditation. I do want to be sensitive to the fact that meditation, on the one hand, has a lot of cultural underpinnings, especially when we talk about what people normally think of when they think of meditation. So, you just like with, say, something like yoga, you do want to be respectful of where a lot of that came from. And it's easy with the kind of capitalist environment that we live in to basically try and productize everything and denude it of its historical background. But meditation is actually a common practice in many different traditions, including in Christianity, right? And the way that I use it is I focus on mindfulness meditation. And so I am simply trying to do practices to be more present in the moment. And that helps me to catch these negative thoughts, to catch these behaviors, and to respond to them in a healthy, loving way. And so cognitive behavioral therapy is kind of a top-down approach, and meditation can be a bottom-up approach. And the two together can work very well. There's a book, I didn't think to put it in the recommended reading, but it's an anxiety workbook, and I can find the link at some point, or feel free to email me at eugene@sequelgene.com, or you can ping me on Twitter at sequelgene. But when we talk about anxiety comes from two places. There's worry and rumination, which comes from more the prefrontal cortex side, the thinking side, and then there's fear and automatic responses that comes from your amygdala and more of your fear response. And things like these two types of therapies work well for each of those spots, right? So cognitive behavioral therapy is good for that prefrontal cortex, that rumination that's just spinning your gears. And meditation can be really good for more of that amygdala based thinking, this stuff where it's just this gut feel. Checking out is talk therapy. So I'm currently seeing a therapist. I started back at the beginning of the winter because my husband asked me to, but also because I always have struggles with wintertime, and this has been a rough year in general. And I found it helpful. A lot of it has been reframing a lot of my assumptions and axioms about things, right? Like just basically talking through, it's like, well, why do I feel so bad if I miss a meeting? And a lot of it is because of the way that I was raised and because of expectations and all this stuff when I was younger, I feel like if I don't do a good job, bad things are going to happen, right? So I find talk therapy to be helpful, but you have to find someone who clicks with you. And so that may involve a couple tries, and it can be difficult. And then finally, antidepressants. So I am on an SSRI, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor called Lexapro. Technically, I'm on the generic version. And antidepressants, again, I am not a doctor. Definitely talk to a psychiatrist. But my understanding is I know for a fact they take a while to take effect. From my personal experience, it probably took 4 to 6 weeks to really start to see the benefit of antidepressants. And so you have to be prepared for that and prepared for side effects. Like I have tolerated the drug very well, but when I was getting on it, I had just a bunch of different side effects. Like it felt like that one time I tried to run a 4K or 5K without any practice, and my face just felt like tight and all this kind of stuff. But I know some people have had to try different ones and hop around a bit. And so it can be a lot of work finding the right one for you. And again, from my limited understanding, there is a risk of some degree of habituation, right? And so I'm actually trying to go down in dose because it's hard to tell if it's just this past year and how that's been, or, if I'm habituating to it. But for me, antidepressants have been amazing. And the way that I think about it is if my mood is this sine wave, it has not made me happy all the time, but it put a floor function on that. And so my lows aren't as low, and so I still have anxiety, I still have issues, but it's really flattened out that bottom and just made me healthier. And so I think in my limited personal opinion, antidepressants are a really great way to give you the space and structure to work on all the other stuff while you're dealing with this, instead of trying to basically, run a race with a broken leg. Like, let's get it in a cast first or something, and then we'll figure out the physical training, so to speak. So those are treatments that I've engaged in. And then lifestyle changes. A lot of this stuff is simple. Sleep. Get sleep, please. Nobody is impressed if you're pulling all-nighters. One of the nice things about collecting data, I have empirical evidence that I have twice as many automatic negative thoughts when I've had a bad night's sleep. So if I have a low blood sugar and I wake up in the morning, I have twice as many automatic negative thoughts. And so that's pretty straightforward. Another one for me is sunshine. I probably have some undiagnosed seasonal affective disorder, and things are always more difficult in the wintertime. And we have just learned that we have to ship me somewhere sunny and warm for a week in the winter or things get bad. My husband is totally on board with that. This year, that wasn't an option, but as soon as we were vaccinated, we, spent a vacation in beautiful Cleveland, Ohio, and sorry, Lisa, and got me some sunshine. Another thing is social support. Like, this has been a very isolating year, but it makes such a huge difference to have contacts, to have friends, to have people to talk to have these connections. And I really, really encourage you to lean on that. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but I feel like I've heard there's been studies where, like, how many people can you call at 3 a.m. with an issue? And if you have 3 of those folks, you're in a much better place emotionally and health-wise than if not. There's exercise. I've also noticed significant improvements from this. For me, if I stop exercising for a week, my mental health goes off a cliff. I've seen it happen multiple times. I've measured it. Every time I get like a cold, I'm like, this is going to be a bad time, because if I don't exercise for a week, that lack of cardio has a bunch of physiological effects on me. And so it's very important that I'm exercising on a regular basis. Another one is habit building. So a lot of this stuff is very hard to do when you're depressed, like that self-explanatory, right? And so one of my goals for 2021 is to turn all of these things into habits. Like I've gotten to the point where I have a little modal dialogue, a VB script that pops up and says, go exercise, and I go exercise, right? And so the things that you can do to turn this into habits are going to help carry you through the most difficult times. One other thing on the treatments that I forgot to include there is journaling or journal therapy. There is evidence that it can help with traumatic events, traumatic memories. For me, I find journaling to be very helpful for whenever something is so difficult to think about that I just I pull away from it. You know, when a negative thought is so uncomfortable that I treat it like a hot stove. And so I found it good for restructuring those thoughts and for helping to build positive automatic thoughts, like treating me exploring how I feel as something brave, for example. All right. Finally, some recommended reading, and then time for any questions. So my number one recommended reading is Feeling Good by David Burns. So this was one of the first significant books on cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's a bit dated, but it's very well written. And it does a good job of listing out those cognitive distortions, giving you exercises for identifying them, and just walking you through examples where it's so funny that when you hear someone else talk about, oh, I forgot to pack my kid's lunch, I'm a terrible mother. You look at it and go, that's silly. And then you look at your own thoughts that you've just written down because you're doing these exercises. You're like, well, this seems similar, right? Another book that I recommend if you're interested in mindfulness meditation, or at least some variety, 10% Happier by Dan Harris. I enjoyed the audiobook. Dan Harris was one of the hosts of Good Morning America. He's on the news, and most of the book is about him doing stupid stuff and then finding meditation and helping improve his life. So, a lot of it's about how he was a war correspondent and how he became depressed and didn't want to acknowledge it and instead started doing hard drugs and then went, oh, this is bad, and had a panic attack on live television, and then found out about meditation, how that helped him. And so it's an enjoyable read, even if you never decide to meditate. One of the books that was most helpful for me when I first started doing this was the Cognitive Behavioral Workbook for Depression by William Nouse. It's nice because it has all these different chapters about all these different parts, including what I talked about, those three horsemen of helpless, hopeless, and worthless. And it's got exercises to go through, and it's very concrete. I know a lot of folks here are very kind of scientific and that sort of thing, and so you may want to check out The Upward Spiral by Alex Korb. It's got concrete recommendations, but it's also based on neuroscience. And so if you're like, well, some of this stuff feels wishy-washy, The Upward Spiral is really good because it's based on, okay, here's the science for this stuff. And then finally, Overcoming Depression. I read this back in college, and I found it helpful because it had a mix of what causes depression, self-compassion, self-kindness exercises, as well as some of this cognitive behavioral therapy kind of stuff. Whew. All right. So that is the bulk of the talk. And so we've got a good 10 minutes or so. And so it looks like we have some questions and we have chat. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I'm going to read you your compliment first.
All right.
So
I will take it.
It says, thanks, Eugene, for an open, honest, vulnerable, and really valuable session. Very much appreciated. You've got other compliments as well, but that was a long one. So,
sure. Understood.
So I figured I'd read you the really long one, but a bunch of people are saying, thank you, great job, excellent, all that good stuff. And I do have two questions. So
yeah.
What things would you like others to do to help you when you're depressed, or for us to help others when they are struggling?
Yeah, no, that's a a really good question. So there's another book that I really enjoyed reading called Nonviolent Communication. Satya Nadella is a fan of it, so it can't be that bad. But one of the things that comes up in that book is that people are really bad at being present, right? They want to fix it, or they want to storytell, or they want to, they shut down, right? And so, there's this great video called It's Not About the Nail. Go ahead and search for it on YouTube. But just this idea of being present, and, that can be so helpful to just have someone who's willing to like be there and to share in that suffering, which is, it feels like a weird way of putting it, but there's a Death Cab for Cutie song called Love is Watching Someone Die, which again, very dramatic, but in my own experience with like youth leadership, so much of it is just about just being there. I think that's definitely helpful. I think depression has a tendency to be self-isolating. And so finding a non-overbearing, non-obtrusive way to like just ping somebody and be like, hey, how's it going? Like not necessarily prompting for like, tell me about all the terrible things, but it's natural to stop reaching out to people, to stop being interested in specific activities and that sort of thing. And so sometimes just like being like, hey, what's up kind of thing can, I think, be very helpful. I think those are all useful. And then honestly, part of the reason I did this talk is I think if we can role model good behavior, it can make other people comfortable doing the same. And so what I mean is, in the United States, we have this thing where someone will ask you, hey, how are you doing? And you have to figure out, is this the 95% time where the response is, oh, things are going great, right? And it's just like this courtesy, or is it the 5% time where you can be like, well, we found black mold in my basement, right? And so I think finding healthy ways to be honest about what you're dealing with, not even depression, just like, like I have to go take my mom to a bird fair in Medina, Ohio, and I'm not happy about it, right? So that other people feel comfortable opening up. So those are some of the things that definitely come to mind. Is like a lot of times, I guess the arc there is oftentimes people with depression less need you to fix it and more need you to help repair the connections that they had with other people. And oftentimes that's just a matter of being present, to enter into their suffering, buy the postcard, and then go. Right? It's like, hey, here's the postcard. I was here. I saw your pain. So that's a great question.
Okay. One other question is imposter syndrome a form of depression?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? So in my mind, imposter syndrome probably can be related or have overlapping causes, but it's very much a broader, in some ways, a more specific issue. In both cases, I would say that they can be treated with cognitive behavioral therapy, because in both cases, they're an issue of that wobbly cart, right? It's, heck, I mean, I'll tell you what, I'm bad at making pretty reports, right? And I've been doing some work and I make reports. I'm like, these seem all right. And I send them over and nobody complains. Or I do work for customers and I'll charge $150 an hour and no one asks for a refund, right? And, even this day I'll be like, this doesn't feel like I don't think I should be like doing this well, right? And so that ungroundedness or that change in your explanatory style, that change in your perception I think in my mind is very similar. But I think that to me, depression is somewhat different. But I could easily see imposter syndrome being kind of a combination of like depressive rumination and anxiety and all that kind of stuff. So in my mind, a lot of the treatments are going to be similar, but I think they're a little bit different. But that's a great question. All right. Does anyone?
Yeah, that was the only 2 questions that came in.
Okay.
And like I said, lots of praises.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate it. All right.
Yeah, somebody actually said they felt better after they got the vaccine as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just funny being able to like see it on a chart and you're like, oh.
One person did say you're allowed to cry if you want to during this presentation, by the way.
Yeah. No, it makes sense.
And then someone said maybe if you can post the other book and video on your blog with these resources, they would be happy for you to do that.
Yeah, I can do that.
And someone said very authentic and from the heart. So, which, yeah, it was very good. I enjoyed listening to it.
Well, thank you. All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I will hop off then.
Eugene.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Stop sharing.